The scent of sawdust and cheap coffee was the perfume of my childhood. The damn hardware store. It was our family's prison, but only I felt the bars. My brother, Caleb, was 2 years older, 31 to my 29. He was sunshine personified, at least to mom and dad. Golden-haired, easy smile, the kind of guy who could charm birds out of trees. And he did, mostly charming our parents into letting him get away with murder. Me? I was the shadow. The grunt. Caleb was the face of the operation. I was the back that broke under the weight of lumber, the hands stained with grease and paint. Ezra, could you take care of that shipment? Dad would bark, barely glancing up from whatever paperwork Caleb was supposedly helping him with. Caleb would be leaning back in his chair, feet up on the desk, regaling a customer with some tall tale. It wasn't just the physical labor. It was the constant gnawing feeling of being less than. Caleb could stroll in hours late, hungover, and Mom would cluck sympathetically, "Oh, he's just got a lot on his mind." If I dared to be 5 minutes behind schedule, I got the "you need to take this seriously" lecture. Our parents, Arthur and Sarah, owned the store. It was their baby, their legacy, and they'd unconsciously started grooming Caleb to inherit it, while I was just there, an extra set of hands. My car was Caleb's personal taxi. My tools, his arsenal, my savings, an emergency fund he felt entitled to. The injustice clawed at me, a constant, low-grade fever. One time, I busted my ass for months, saving every penny for a top-of-the-line welding kit. The moment it arrived, Caleb borrowed it for some quick job down the street. He brought it back a week later, the regulator busted, the gas tank empty. "Whoops," he said, a lazy grin on his face. "Guess it's not working too good now." But hey, it still welds, doesn't it? Rage, cold and sharp, sliced through me. I wanted to smash his face, to make him feel the frustration, the constant taking, the utter disregard. I stormed into the house, ready to explode. "Mom! Dad!" Caleb wrecked my welding kit. Mom sighed, her face etched with that familiar weariness she always seemed to reserve for me. "Ezra, don't make a big deal out of it. It was an accident." "An accident? He uses my stuff, breaks it, and it's just an accident?" Dad finally looked up, his eyes hardening. "He's your brother, Ezra. Don't be so selfish. We can't afford new kits just because of your tantrum." That was it. That was the turning point. I realized I was screaming into a void. They would always take Caleb's side, always excuse his behavior. I started locking my tools in the truck, a tiny act of rebellion, a pathetic attempt to claim something as my own. Caleb's flaws weren't just annoying, they were bleeding the store dry. He had a gambling problem, poker games, sports bets. It was a black hole swallowing every spare penny. I started noticing cash disappearing from the register. Small amounts at first, a 20 here, a 50 there. Then it escalated. I tried to subtly mention it to Dad, hoping he'd take notice. "Dad, the till's been short a few times this week. Maybe we should check the security cameras?" Dad waved his hand dismissively. "Caleb's going through a rough patch, Ezra. Don't make a big deal out of it. He'll figure it out." "A rough patch?" "He's stealing from the store." Dad's face darkened. "Don't accuse your brother of theft, Ezra. You don't know what you're talking about." But I did know. I saw the way Caleb's eyes flickered when he handled cash, the subtle glances around the store, the increasing frequency of his bathroom breaks near the register. He was bleeding us dry, and they were too blind to see it. I started quietly covering the shortages myself, taking money from my already meager paycheck. I couldn't stand the thought of the store going under, even if my family seemed determined to drive it into the ground. It was a stupid, selfless act, born from a twisted sense of responsibility. The dam finally burst one Friday night. Caleb had ditched me again, leaving me to unload a mountain of lumber after closing. My back screamed, my muscles burned, and my temper simmered. I found him in the garage, rifling through Dad's toolbox. the one where he sometimes stashed emergency cash. "Looking for something, Caleb?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. He didn't even look up. "Mind your business, Ezra. The register's been short all week." "Think no one noticed?" "I'll pay it back," he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. "Like last time." "How much this time, Caleb?" "Poker? Football bets? I am working my ass out there to make ends meet, while your gambling is a plague to our shop." He finally turned, his eyes glinting with something ugly. "At least I'm not busting my ass hauling boxes for minimum wage. Maybe if you took a few risks, you wouldn't be stuck scraping by." The words hit like a slap. A lifetime of resentment, of being the lesser son, of being overlooked and underappreciated, boiled over. I lunged at him, shoving him against the wall. We clashed, a whirlwind of fists and grunts. Paint cans went flying, splattering the garage in a chaotic mess of color. The noise brought Mom and Dad running. They burst into the garage just as I had Caleb pinned against the wall, my fist raised. "Ezra!" "Stop it!" Mom screamed, her face contorted with fear and anger. Dad stepped between us, his eyes blazing. "What the hell is going on here?" He glared at me, his disappointment palpable. "He's stealing from the store, Dad. He's got a gambling problem? He's bleeding us dry," I yelled, my voice hoarse with frustration. Dad's face hardened. "I don't want to hear it, Ezra. Caleb's under a lot of stress. You need to stop making things harder for him." There it was again. The same tired excuse. The same unwavering belief in Caleb's inherent goodness. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "He's lying, Dad. Look at him. He's just trying to protect his gambling debts. Can't you even listen to me?" For once, Dad didn't respond. He just looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Go to your room, Ezra, and think about what you've done." I stared at them, my chest heaving. There was no point. They would never believe me. They were too invested in the illusion of Caleb's perfection to see the truth. I turned and walked out, the sound of their voices fading behind me. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of my life crushing me. I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay in that house, in that store, a prisoner in my own family. I started saving every penny, working extra shifts, scrounging for every possible dollar. Freedom wasn't free. It cost sweat, sacrifice, and the constant gnawing feeling of being alone. Around that time, my grandparents, Arthur and Sarah's parents, started struggling. Grandpa's arthritis was crippling him, and Grandma needed expensive medication. They had always been good to me, a haven from the constant drama of my immediate family. To supplement their income, they had stashed about $10,000 in a safe in their house. It wasn't smart, but they didn't trust banks after some financial mess years back. Caleb started visiting them more often, all smiles and forced concern. I knew what he was doing. He was buttering them up, preying on their vulnerability. I barely had time to visit, juggling shifts at the store with side jobs to build my escape fund. I felt a pang of guilt, but I was trapped. I was a prisoner to my own need to escape. Then, one weekend, the money vanished. Poof! Gone! No forced entry, no signs of a break-in, just an empty safe. Panic ripped through the family. Grandpa was frantic, tearing the house apart, convinced he'd misplaced it. Grandma sat silently, her face pale and drawn. The blame game started almost immediately. Theories flew, suspicion festered, and then, inevitably, the finger pointed at me. I was unloading a shipment of roofing shingles when my phone buzzed. It was Dad. "Get to the house." Now, no explanation, no greeting, just cold command. My stomach clenched. When I arrived, the living room felt like a courtroom. My parents sat on the couch, grim-faced. Grandma and Grandpa sat next to them, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disappointment. Caleb stood off to the side, arms crossed, a smug look on his face. Dad didn't waste time. $10,000 is missing. Your grandparents need that money for their medical bills. Tell us what happened. I don't know what to tell you, I said, my voice shaking. I didn't take anything. Mom shot me a look of disbelief. Caleb said he saw you near the safe last time you visited. You've been struggling with rent lately. Maybe you got desperate. Caleb just stood there, silent, his eyes betraying nothing. He was a master manipulator, a chameleon who could blend seamlessly into any situation. He knew exactly how to play them all. Just tell the truth, Ezra, Dad pleaded, his voice laced with a hint of sadness, so we can move on. I looked at Caleb, his face an impassive mask. He's lying. I wouldn't steal from Grandma and Grandpa. You know I wouldn't. Dad shook his head, his eyes filled with a profound disappointment. Then prove it. Pay the money back. Until you do, don't bother coming around here. The words hit me like a physical blow. They actually believed I was capable of such a thing, without a shred of evidence, without even listening to my side of the story. I don't have 10 grand lying around, I protested, my voice rising. How do you want me to prove something I didn't do? Figure it out, Dad snapped, his patience wearing thin. Grandparents were silent. Nobody said a word. I waited, desperately hoping someone would speak up, defend me, see the truth. But the silence just stretched on, a suffocating blanket of disbelief. Dad nodded towards the door. Go pack your stuff. My heart shattered. The silence was deafening. No one stood up for me. The people who were supposed to love and protect me were throwing me away. I stood there for a second, half expecting someone to stop me, to say it was a mistake. But nobody did. I turned and walked out, the weight of their betrayal crushing me. By the time I got home, they'd already tossed my belongings into the trunk of my beat-up truck. Bags of clothes, a few tools, the meager remnants of my life. Caleb stood on the porch, watching me, a smug smile playing on his lips. For a second, I considered confronting him, exposing him for the liar and thief he truly was. But what was the point? They'd already made up their minds. He could point a finger at me and they would believe him without question. That was enough to know there was no place for me there anymore. He pointed and laughed. It was one of the lowest moments of my life. I drove off without looking back, the taste of betrayal bitter on my tongue. The next few weeks were a blur of misery and exhaustion. Getting kicked out wasn't some dramatic, life-altering moment. It was more like being shoved into a dark pit and realizing that no one was coming to pull you out. The apartment I found was a dump. Bare walls, secondhand furniture, and a refrigerator that sounded like it was on its last legs. Rent ate up most of my paycheck from the construction job I'd picked up after quitting the store. Dinner was usually instant noodles or whatever was on sale at the grocery store. The hardest part wasn't the work, though. It was the silence. My parents didn't just cut me off, they made sure everyone else did too. Calls went straight to voicemail. Texts were ignored. Invitations to family gatherings stopped coming. Even friends I'd known for years started pulling away, like they didn't want to get caught in the middle. I stopped reaching out after a while. If they didn't want me around, I wasn't going to beg for their attention. If they thought I couldn't make it without them, they were about to find out how wrong they were. I picked up extra shifts wherever I could, fixing decks, patching roofs, remodeling kitchens. The more jobs I took, the more I learned. Carpentry, plumbing, electrical work. I soaked up every bit of knowledge I could get my hands on. YouTube tutorials, construction manuals, watching the older guys on site. Whatever it took. The pay wasn't great, but it kept me moving. Every busted knuckle, every sleepless night, felt like a step toward paying off a debt I owed myself, and I was determined to pay it off. Nights were the worst. After working all day, I'd come home too tired to do much besides collapse on the couch. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant reminder of the family I'd lost. I kept grinding. Every extra shift, every side gig, every dollar saved. It all added up, little by little. My cousin, Noah, was the only one from the family who stuck around. Noah was a good guy, He worked construction too, so he helped me land a few bigger jobs when I needed an extra set of hands. He was the first one to show up, tools in hand, ready to work. Having someone in my corner helped, but I wasn't leaning on anyone. Every dollar I made went straight back into upgrading my tools and truck. No flashy spending, no wasted cash. It wasn't long before I had to make a choice, stick with my construction crew job, or go all in on my own thing. The decision was terrifying. No safety net, no steady paycheck, just me and whatever jobs I could land. But that was the point. No excuses. I walked into the site office, handed in my notice, and drove home. A mixture of fear and exhilaration churning in my stomach. Going solo wasn't easy. Roofing in the summer heat, crawling under houses to fix busted pipes, hauling drywall until my shoulders ached. None of it was fun, but I didn't care. Every job meant more cash, more skills, and more clients. I focused on quality. I made sure every job was done right the first time. No cutting corners, no rushing to finish early. Reputation mattered more than price, and I wasn't about to screw that up. There was this one job that really got things rolling. This wealthy guy hired me to build a custom deck on his lake house. The job had to be perfect, no shortcuts, no mistakes. I spent 2 weeks measuring, cutting, and building, working late into the evening with only a flashlight when the sun went down. By the time I finished, my hands were raw and I was running on fumes. But the guy was impressed. He started recommending me to his clients. Turns out, he was a real estate investor with properties all over the county. Suddenly, I wasn't just fixing decks. I was remodeling rental properties, flipping houses, and handling renovation contracts that paid more in a month than I used to make in 3. The money started rolling in faster than I could spend it. First thing I did was upgrade my truck. Nothing flashy, just a solid workhorse with enough space for tools and materials. I bought better equipment too, table saws, power drills, everything I needed to handle bigger jobs. I even picked up a trailer to haul lumber and debris, saving me time and money on every job. Every dollar that didn't go into tools or gas went straight into savings. No fancy dinners, no vacations, just slow, steady progress. I was too busy working to spend money anyway. 7 days a week, sunup to sundown, I was either on a job site or lining up the next gig. I didn't have much of a social life, but it wasn't my priority. I was building something real, something mine. Meanwhile, Caleb was still circling the drain. His gambling problem wasn't a secret anymore. Word around town was that he owed money to half the guys he used to hang out with. A few of them even showed up at the store looking for him. But my parents covered for him, same as always, convinced he'd get back on track any day now. Didn't bother me. I had bigger things to worry about. A year in, I had more work than I could handle. I started turning down small jobs just to keep up with the bigger ones. Home remodels, commercial renovations, even a few custom builds. The kind of work that paid enough to keep my crews busy for weeks at a time. I bought a second truck, hired more guys, and expanded my crew to 3 teams. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Building his empire, running his team, living the impossible dream. 3 crews running jobs across the state, pulling in 6 figures a year, and living in a house I owned outright. All built from nothing. No handouts, no shortcuts. Success didn't happen overnight. Every time I drove past my parents' store, I remembered the nights I spent unloading trucks, while Caleb sat in the back pretending to do paperwork. I remembered the look on his face when I drove away that day, the smirk, the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten away with it. And every time I thought about slowing down, I remembered that moment and pushed even harder. With the money rolling in, I expanded fast. I bought more trucks, hired more guys, carpenters, electricians, plumbers. I kept my crews lean. No slackers, no dead weight. If a guy couldn't pull his weight or started showing up late, he was gone. Simple as that. I didn't have time to babysit anyone. Every job had to be done right the first time. Noah stayed in the picture, helping with networking and landing clients. He knew everyone: property managers, real estate developers, even a few city officials. Thanks to him, I scored a contract with a developer building luxury condos downtown. That one job alone pulled in more money than my entire first year of side gigs. As the years passed, I didn't think much about my family anymore. My days were packed with renovation projects, managing crews, and chasing deadlines. I barely had time to sleep, let alone dwell on what happened. Noah would fill me in from time to time. Apparently, Caleb had tried to start his own handyman business at one point. Probably figured if I could do it, so could he. But, surprise, surprise, it didn't last long. Poor management, missed deadlines, and a reputation for cutting corners killed any chance he had. Clients started leaving bad reviews. Word spread, and soon nobody wanted to hire him. The funny thing was, I didn't feel much of anything about it. No satisfaction, no sense of justice, just indifference. I was too focused on my own life to care. Karma has a way of showing up when you least expect it. It all came to a head one summer. During a family get-together I wasn't invited to. Noah filled me in later. Apparently, Caleb showed up already looking rough, nursing the kind of stress that comes from owing money to people who don't forget debts. True to form, he couldn't keep his mouth shut. After a few too many drinks, he started bragging, talking about his big wins and how he was going to turn things around soon. And then he slipped up. Maybe he thought no one would catch it. Or maybe he was just too far gone to care. But somewhere in the middle of his rambling, he let it slip that he'd borrowed the money from Grandpa's safe to cover a gambling debt. Thought he'd win big and put it back before anyone noticed. Only the winning part never happened. Grandpa didn't yell or make a scene. He just stood up, looked Caleb square in the eye, and told him to leave. No more handouts, no more second chances. Grandma didn't say anything. She just sat there, with her hands folded in her lap, looking like she'd known the truth all along. Caleb tried to talk his way out of it, said he'd pay them back once he got back on his feet. Nobody bought it. My parents, true to form, tried to smooth things over. He's going through a rough patch. We just need to support him. Grandpa wasn't having it. Don't make excuses for him. He stole from us and blamed it on his brother. That's the kind of man he is. That was the end of it. Caleb left, slamming the door behind him. Nobody followed. When Noah called to tell me, I didn't say much. Just let the news settle in. I wasn't surprised. I'd suspected Caleb from the start. But hearing the truth out loud still hit differently. Not because it changed anything. My family had already made their choice years ago. But there was a part of me that felt vindicated. I asked Noah how the rest of the family reacted. Turns out, most of them just wanted to move on. Nobody talked about how they'd all stood by while I got kicked out. Nobody brought up the fact that they'd cut me off without a second thought. It was like they all just wanted to pretend none of it had ever happened. The only one who seemed to care was Grandpa. A few days after the blow-up, he called me for the first time in years. I almost didn't pick up. Thought maybe he wanted to smooth things over, pretend like nothing had happened. He didn't say much, just asked how I was doing, if business was going well. I could hear the strain in his voice, like he wasn't sure what to say. Finally, after a long pause, he said, "I should have spoken up that day, Ezra. I knew you didn't take that money. But I guess I didn't have the courage to go against the rest of the family." I didn't say much in response, just told him I was doing fine. Maybe if he'd called years earlier, things would have been different. But by then, I'd already built a life without them. I didn't need their apologies. After that, I didn't hear from him again. Noah told me later that Grandpa stopped coming to family gatherings as often. Guess the whole thing hit him harder than anyone realized. As for Caleb, things didn't get any better. Last I heard, he was still bouncing between jobs, trying to scrape together enough to keep the lights on. Nobody wanted to hire a guy with a reputation for stealing from his own family. Even the people he used to gamble with stopped loaning him money. Word gets around fast in a small town. My parents kept their distance too. Whether it was guilt or pride, I didn't know. But they never reached out. Not until the day they needed something from me. A few months after the big news at the family gathering, life had settled into a rhythm. Business was booming. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed while I was going over invoices at my kitchen table. I froze. It was my dad. I hadn't heard from him in years. For a second, I thought about letting it go to voicemail. But something told me to answer. "Ezra?" "It's been a while," he said. He sounded like he wasn't sure how to start. "Yeah, it has. What's up?" I kept my tone flat. No point in pretending this was a social call. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, he finally spat it out. "The store's hit a rough patch, Ezra. Some unexpected expenses came up, and we're having trouble keeping up with the bills. I heard you've been doing well. Thought maybe you could help out. Maybe invest a little to keep things running." The audacity. The same guy who kicked me out without proof was now asking for my money. I stared at the phone for a moment, speechless. Part of me wanted to laugh and hang up without another word. But instead, I just said, "I'll think about it," and ended the call. The idea started forming almost immediately, a slow burn of resentment and opportunity. It was so crazy, so audacious, that it just might work. A week later, I called them back. We agreed to meet at a diner near the old neighborhood. Mom and Dad sat across from me, looking worn down, their faces etched with worry. No apologies, no acknowledgement of the past, just awkward small talk until Dad finally got to the point. "The bank's calling in our loans," he said, his voice strained. "If we can't come up with the money, we'll lose the store. We need an investor, someone we can trust." I let the silence stretch out just long enough to make them squirm. Then I laid out my terms. "I'll pay off the debts," I said, my voice cold and devoid of emotion. "But I want 51% ownership, majority control, full authority to hire, fire, and make any decisions I see fit. No exceptions." They were stunned. Their faces paled. They probably expected me to just hand over a check, no strings attached. "You can't be serious, Ezra," Mom exclaimed, her voice rising. "That's our store. It's been in the family for generations. Take it or leave it," I said, cutting her off. "That's the only way I'll help you. Otherwise, the store is done for." A long silence followed. I could see the struggle in their eyes, their pride clashing with the reality of their situation. But pride doesn't pay the bills. Finally, Dad nodded, his face etched with defeat. "All right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. They signed the papers right there in the diner, their hands trembling. Just like that, I became the owner of the business they once kicked me out of. Taking control of the store didn't feel like some big victory at first. It was just another job, another challenge to tackle. But as the weeks went by, the reality of it started to sink in. I wasn't just running the place, I owned it. The same building where I used to haul boxes and mop floors was now mine. Every decision, every paycheck, every dollar of profit, it all came through me. The first thing I did was go through the books. The place was a mess. Missed payments, bad inventory orders, deals that should have never been signed. I spent the next week tearing through every account, cutting unnecessary expenses, and locking down the budget. No more freebies for family, no more favors that cut into profits. Then I moved to cleaning house. Tyler had to go first. But there were still a few employees who'd gotten too comfortable, slacking off, showing up late, and acting like they were doing me a favor just by showing up. I gave them a week to shape up. Most of them didn't. So they were gone. No warnings, no second chances. I needed people who understood that this wasn't the same store it used to be. Once the staffing issues were sorted, I turned my focus to the finances. The books were even worse than I expected. Overdue bills, bad supplier contracts, and enough wasted inventory to fill a warehouse. I spent hours going through every account, cutting unnecessary expenses, and renegotiating deals with suppliers. Some of them tried to push back, thinking they could take advantage of the new owner. But I made it clear that those days were over. Either they gave me better terms or I'd take my business elsewhere. Most of them caved, the ones who didn't got replaced. With the finances under control, I tackled the inventory. Half the shelves were stocked with items that nobody bought, cheap tools, outdated equipment, and random hardware that had been collecting dust for years. I cleared it all out, slashed prices to move the dead stock, and used the cash to bring in products that customers actually wanted. I added new lines of power tools, high-quality building materials, and specialty items that contractors couldn't get anywhere else in town. As for Tyler, it was time to give him what he deserved. I walked into his office Monday morning and dropped the termination letter on his desk. "Your last paycheck," I said, my voice flat. "You're done here. You can't do this," he shouted, his face turning red. "Yes, I can," I said, cutting him off. And I just did. Security walked him out while the staff watched. Nobody defended him. Nobody even looked surprised. With Tyler gone, I turned my focus to the rest of the business. Sales picked up almost immediately. Contractors started coming in more often because they knew we had what they needed. Homeowners appreciated the better selection and cleaner store. I made sure the place looked professional, organized shelves, clear signage, and a checkout process that didn't take half an hour. I even invested in a new point-of-sale system to speed things up and keep better track of inventory. Within 6 months, the store was back in the black. Sales were up, expenses were down, and profits were soaring. By the end of the year, the store was pulling in more revenue than it had in the last 5 years combined. Suppliers started offering me better deals, and local contractors began recommending us to their crews. Word spread fast that the store was under new management, and that this time, things were done right. My parents, they stayed on as employees. No special treatment, no extra perks. They clocked in and out like everyone else. If they didn't like it, they knew where the door was. I made it clear from day one, this wasn't a family favor, this was a business. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger or resentment, just a sense of closure. I'd built my success without them, and now every time they walked into that store, they'd know exactly who they answered to. Meanwhile, Tyler's downward spiral didn't slow down. No job, no money, and no more handouts from mom and dad. Last I heard, he was working part-time at a warehouse across town, barely scraping by. Nobody wanted to hire a guy with his reputation, not after the gambling debts, missed shifts, and burned bridges. Even the people he used to hang out with had stopped returning his calls. He'd used up all his favors, and then some. Couldn't say I felt bad. Mom and Dad never said much about him, but I could tell it weighed on them. They never asked me to help Tyler, though. Not after everything that had happened. Maybe they knew better. It didn't matter. Tyler had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. I wasn't about to waste my time trying to save someone who once tried to ruin my life. As for the rest of the family, most of them kept their distance. A few relatives started showing up at the store again, once they heard I was running it. But the conversations were always short and awkward. Nobody brought up what had happened with the money, and nobody apologized for turning their backs on me. It was like they all wanted to pretend it had never happened. Fine by me. I wasn't interested in rehashing the past. Grandpa was different. He stopped by one afternoon, unannounced. I was in the middle of unloading a shipment when I saw him standing near the entrance. For a second, I thought about pretending I hadn't seen him, but he came over, his eyes weary. He stood there in awkward silence for a moment. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Place looks good," he said, his voice raspy. "Thanks," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He looked down. "I should have spoken up that day, Ezra. I knew you didn't take that money. But, well, I didn't have the courage to stand against the crowd." I looked him in the eye and stopped him before he could apologize. "Save it, Grandpa. I'm doing good after all." Maybe if he'd said those words years ago, things would have been different. But standing there, surrounded by the business I'd built with my own 2 hands, I realized I didn't need his apology. I'd already proven everything I needed to prove. After a few more minutes of small talk, he left. I never saw him again after that. Noah told me later that Grandpa had stopped going to family gatherings and kept to himself for the most part. Maybe the guilt was too much, or maybe he just got tired of the drama. By the time the next year rolled around, the store was running like a well-oiled machine. Profits were steady, and the customers knew they could count on us. I kept building my construction business, running 3 solid crews while managing the store on the side. These days, I don't think much about the past. I'm living in a different world, light years away from the pain of a golden child family dynamic. Life's better than ever. I built the business, and it's good enough. I learned to like my name and my personality. A sense of quiet satisfaction settled over me. I'd proven them wrong. I'd risen from the ashes of their rejection and built something that even they couldn't deny. The hardware store, the construction business, the life I had forged were monuments to my resilience. But peace is a fickle thing. It doesn't last. You make it, nurture it, and then it gets stolen again. I had a crew working on a historic renovation downtown, a beautiful old building with good bones and a checkered past. The developer, a guy named Frank, was notoriously demanding. Everything had to be perfect, period correct, and on a tight deadline. The money was good, but the pressure was relentless. One late evening, after everyone else had gone home, I was checking the electrical wiring. I saw Frank in one of the rooms. He was talking to a guy I didn't know, his voice hushed and urgent. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. Got to get this done by Friday. Frank muttered, problem with the permits. The other guy replied, his voice a low growl. Don't care how you do it, just make it disappear. My stomach twisted. Something didn't feel right. Frank's desperation, the veiled threats, the clandestine meeting, it all pointed to something shady. I finished my inspection and quietly slipped out, my mind racing. Frank was known for cutting corners, but this felt different. This felt like something bigger, something dangerous. I debated what to do. Should I confront Frank? Call the authorities? Or just mind my own business and collect my paycheck? The old me, the one who just wanted to be left alone, would have chosen the latter. But the new me, the one who had clawed his way to the top, couldn't ignore it. I owed it to myself, to my crew, to the integrity of my work, to do the right thing. The next morning, I called Noah. He had connections, knew the players in town. I told him what I'd overheard, asking him to dig around, see what he could find. Noah called me back later that afternoon, his voice grim. Ezra, Frank's in deep with some bad people. The permits for that building are bogus. He's bribing city officials to look the other way. My blood ran cold. I was caught in the middle of a corruption scheme. If I continued working on the project, I'd be complicit. If I quit, I'd be breaking my contract, potentially facing legal repercussions. But there was no way I could stay. I wouldn't be a party to Frank's illegal activities. I called Frank, telling him I needed to talk. We met at a coffee shop near the construction site. Frank, I know about the permits, I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. I know you're bribing people to get this project done. Frank's face turned ashen. He looked around nervously, then leaned in, his voice a low hiss. You don't know anything, Ezra, and it's best if you keep it that way. I can't, I said. I can't be involved in this. I'm pulling my crew off the job. Frank's eyes narrowed. You can't do that, Ezra. You signed a contract. You'll be in breach. I don't care, I said, standing up. I'm not risking my reputation, my business, for your illegal schemes. You'll regret this, Ezra, Frank snarled, his face contorted with rage. You've made a powerful enemy. I walked away, my heart pounding. I knew I'd made the right decision, but I also knew I'd opened myself up to a world of trouble. The threats started almost immediately. Vandalism at my job sites. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. My tires were slashed. My truck was keyed. Frank was making good on his promise. I tried to report it to the police, but they were dismissive. Sounds like a business dispute, one of the officers said, shrugging. We can't do much without solid evidence. I knew Frank had people on the inside, corrupt cops who were protecting him. I was on my own. I started carrying a gun, sleeping with one eye open. I couldn't trust anyone. I was living in a constant state of paranoia, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The pressure was relentless, but I refused to back down. I'd come too far to be intimidated by a bully like Frank. I reached out to Noah again, asking him to find someone who could help me, someone who wasn't afraid of Frank. Noah put me in touch with a private investigator, a woman named Maria. She was tough, resourceful, and had a reputation for getting results. I met with Maria, telling her everything. She listened intently, her eyes sharp and assessing. Frank's a dangerous man, Ezra, she said. He's not afraid to play dirty, but he's also sloppy. We can find something on him. Maria started digging, following Frank, interviewing his associates, uncovering his web of corruption. It wasn't long before she had enough evidence to bring him down. I met with Maria again, her face grim. Frank's planning something big, Ezra. Something that could hurt a lot of people. We have to stop him. Maria had discovered that Frank was planning to sabotage the building's structural integrity to save money on materials. He was willing to risk the lives of future tenants for his own profit. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let Frank get away with it. I had to expose him, even if it meant putting myself in even greater danger. I agreed to wear a wire, to record my next conversation with Frank. Maria arranged the meeting, setting up a sting operation with the help of a few trusted FBI agents. I met with Frank at the construction site, my heart pounding. I tried to act normal, pretending that everything was fine. Frank, I've been thinking, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Maybe we can work this out. Maybe I can finish the project after all. Frank's eyes lit up. I knew you'd see things my way, Ezra. You're a smart guy. But there's one condition, I said. I need to know everything. I need to know exactly what you're planning. Frank hesitated, his eyes darting around nervously. I don't know what you're talking about, Ezra. Don't play dumb, Frank, I said, my voice hardening. I know about the structural sabotage. I know you're planning to risk people's lives. Frank's face turned ashen. He knew he'd been caught. You wouldn't, he hissed, his eyes filled with venom. You wouldn't turn on me. I already have, I said. Just then, the FBI agents stormed the building, arresting Frank and his associates. The news spread like wildfire. Frank's corruption was exposed, his reputation ruined. He was facing serious charges, potentially spending years in prison. The threats stopped. The vandalism ceased. I was finally free. The experience shook me to my core. I'd stared into the abyss and emerged stronger, more determined than ever. I'd faced my demons and won. I poured myself into my work, expanding my business, taking on bigger and more challenging projects. I became known for my integrity, my commitment to quality, and my unwavering refusal to compromise my values. The hardware store continued to thrive, a testament to my hard work and dedication. My parents, while never fully acknowledging their past mistakes, seemed to have finally gained a measure of respect for me. They kept their business professional at the shop. Caleb, still adrift and struggling, remained a distant figure. I didn't hate him, but I couldn't bring myself to forgive him either. The scars of the past were too deep. I thought back to the moment he had laughed in my face as I was driven away. I decided that those kinds of moments won't ever affect me again. I'm too much of a winner for them. Noah continued to be my rock, my confidant, my friend. He was the only family I truly needed. Years passed. I built a life I could be proud of. A life filled with purpose, integrity, and genuine connection. I finally found peace, not just in my success, but in the knowledge that I had stayed true to myself, even when it was the hardest thing to do. And as I stood, looking out over the city I had helped to build, I knew that my legacy wouldn't be defined by the family who had rejected me, but by the man I had become in spite of them. It was a legacy of resilience, integrity, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. It was a legacy of building something real, something lasting, something that would stand the test of time. It was a legacy forged in the fires of adversity, and it was mine, and mine alone. And that was more than enough. The end.